to go ahead and keep us on schedule because I know several of our guests some need to go to class, and I'll explain that in a minute. Others have other appointments, so forth. But in addition to this Nance lecture, one of the individuals that I called because we thought about doing a lunch was my friend Andy Taylor, who is a professor of political science at NC State's School of Government and International Affairs. And he has been to several of our events, and we started talking a little bit, and the idea of maybe talking about China, maybe that would be a good program, and he got really good feedback. So we chose this location because we wanted some of his colleagues and students who could walk quickly from NC State to come join us, because we feel like that's what Senator Helms would want, and Admiral Nance would want, and that's what we want as well. So Dr. Taylor is here with us, and he is going to introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you. Very pleased to be here. Thank you very much for having us. As people affiliated with NC State, very pleased to be here with Brian and you all today. Let me introduce to you our speaker, who is Walter Lohman. He is the director of the Heritage Foundation's Asian Studies Center, which is the Heritage's oldest center. It was established in 1983 and is home to research fellows and scholars who develop recommendations to further American interests of freedom and security in the Indo-Pacific region. In addition to his management responsibilities, Loman is a policy analyst focused on U.S. relations with his treaty allies in Japan, South Korea, and Australia, as well as with India and countries of Southeast Asia. He is also the leading voice at Heritage on the U.S.-Taiwan relationship and is a close observer of China policy. Recognizing the strength of America's historical and cultural ties to Europe, in recent years, Loman has spearheaded a heritage effort to encourage better coordination in all of these areas with our transatlantic allies and partners. He joined Heritage in 2006 as Senior Research Fellow for Southeast Asia, Australia and New Zealand, and was promoted to Director the following spring. Since 2013, he served as an adjunct professor at Georgetown, where he's led graduate seminars on American foreign policy interests in Southeast Asia and the role of Congress in Asia policy making. He served previously 4 years as Senior Vice President and Executive Director of the U.S. Asian Business Council. There he oversaw the Regional Trade Association's mission of building U.S. market share in Southeast Asia, opened the organization's offices in Indonesia and Thailand, and led multiple delegations of Fortune 500 companies of the region. He participated in business and policy forums and regularly represented the Council in interaction with high-level Asian officials. In the 1990s, Loman was the Council's senior country director representing American interests in Indonesia and Singapore. His background in international trade continues to influence his work at Heritage, and he's heavily involved in developing market-friendly solutions to international challenges. The formative years of his career, he served as senior professional Republican staffer to Senator Helms, who at the time was ranking Republican on foreign relations, particularly on issues of concerning East Asia. From 1991 to 1996, he was a policy aide to Senator John McCain, advising him on foreign policy, trade, and defense issues and drafting related legislation. He holds a bachelor's degree in humanities from Virginia Wesleyan and a master's degree in foreign affairs from Virginia. Originally from Norfolk, he now resides in Falls Church with his wife and 3 sons. Please join me in welcoming Walter Lohman.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Andy. Well, I drove up here thinking I was going to make a clever joke about the Andy Griffith Show. But as I came and started talking to you, I realized that many people have preceded me in making that same joke. So I won't say anything about that. There was a couple ways I could go about this coming in today. I could make some notes and sort of speak a little bit extemporaneously, and which can be more engaging, as any of you know who do any public speaking. Or I could prepare something and be a little bit more deliberate about it. I chose to prepare something, so forgive me a little bit. I'll try to keep it loose and entertaining, or at least engaging. and hopefully allow for enough time that we can have some question and answer so we can talk about whatever it is that you want to talk about. But I did want to be a little bit more formal than maybe just some extemporaneous notes here. I really appreciate greatly being a part of this tribute to Admiral Nance. I didn't work for Senator Helms in the years that Admiral Nance was there. At that time, I worked for Senator McCain. But I do remember very vividly when Admiral Nance came in and took the helm of that committee. Because as you may know, anybody familiar with the history, he came in and really cleaned house. There were a few problems there. And we were feeling the problems very directly in our office, and when he came in, he fixed all that, and it reverberated very loudly throughout the Senate. Admiral Nance was very good, as you know, as the best staffers are at channeling their boss. When the Admiral spoke, everyone knew that he was speaking for Senator Helms. They were almost one and the same person as far as their work in the Senate was concerned, and maybe from what I read, maybe even closer, that close in other aspects of their lives. Senator McCain also had a close connection to Admiral Nance, the U.S. Navy. So anyone familiar with the Navy knows how close a brotherhood that is. And Helms and McCain didn't agree on everything. And I mean that literally, they didn't agree on everything. Because a lot of times you say that, what you really mean is they didn't agree on anything, right? But I mean literally, they didn't agree on everything, but they agreed on quite a bit, especially in my world on foreign policy and on Asia, and that's why it was easy for me to make a transition onto Senator Helms' staff several years later. It was such an honor for me to work for Senator Helms. My first experience with him as a boss, you know, as a staffer on the committee, was I had prepared some legislation on North Korea. Imagine that, we're still debating the same thing, but on the North Korean nuclear program, and he called me up to his office to talk about it. So I brought him the piece of legislation I had drafted, and I gave it to him, and he took out his blue felt tip pen and he said, you know, do you mind if I change this a little bit? And I was like, well, you're the boss. I mean, you can do whatever you want. It's your, I didn't say that, of course, but that was what I was thinking was, wow, you know, he was such a gentlemanly figure. And now I know that you all have probably heard this a million times by now, but no one that I've ever spoken to that was at all associated with Senator Helms said anything but that he was the finest gentleman. And I mean people who disagreed with him on the complete other side of every issue, that didn't agree with him on anything, still got along with him terrifically. In fact, you know, on the committee, he and Senator Biden got along much better than Senator Biden and Senator Lugar did later when Senator Lugar took over the committee. And you would think, well, Lugar is a different kind of middle of the road, you know, moderate guy, you know, they should get along better. But actually on a personal level, because of Senator Helms' fine personal skills, he and Joe Biden got along quite well. I also have to say it was a fine experience working on the committee with so many great people that I stay in touch with today, people that are still good friends of mine and now go back 20 years. There was a very close-knit family that we had there on that staff, and when I joined, I was joining a family bigger than I knew at the time. So a lot of stories I could tell you about all that. I won't go into any of them because I could be here all day just talking about fun Senate stories. Brian asked me to come in and talk about Asia policy. So what I'm going to try to do is just make 5 points here. Along the way, I'll touch on some connections to the current administration and Congress, but it's a topic bigger than that. And so I wanted to talk about it in a general way, and maybe in the discussion we can talk about some of the very most current issues or whatever may be on your mind. First, I want to just set a baseline for what we're talking about when we talk about Asia policy. Asia is about 24 countries as far as we define it at Heritage Foundation, you know, my area of responsibility. 3 billion people, more actually, a little less than half the world's population. Of course, there's always been a lot of people in Asia, right? Nothing's new about that. We've been talking about that for literally centuries. But the thing is now that it represents 40% of the global economy. In the next 20 years or so, it'll account for more than half of the global economy. And this means a lot to the United States. We do $1.6 trillion in trade annually with the region just in goods. We do more if you add services to that. We've got almost $1 trillion invested. Our companies have about $1 trillion invested in the region. Investment, they've got investment here. We got this huge bilateral trade relationship with Asia, and not just with China. I don't want to go into too many statistics because I know that's a clear way of, a perfect way of making everyone's eyes cloud over. But the point is, like a old boss of mine, Phil Truelock, who, if any of you are familiar with the conservative movement, Phil Truelock worked for Heritage Foundation about 30 years, told me one time, okay, I get it, Asia's big. So, okay, yeah. But it is big, and you have to kind of find a way to internalize that, I think, to understand what's at stake. Even when you look at the China relationship, I think you have to appreciate the scale of it. The size of the relationship we have with the Chinese, both on the economic side, on people-to-people ties, a number of different ways to look at it. You have to understand how central it is to global supply chains and all the rest. And I could give you some more statistics on that. But China is the center of a whole supply network in the region that, despite, I think, what a lot of people are talking about, or really people who think of the world in terms of geopolitics and state-to-state conflict and that sort of thing, despite their best hopes, that is that somehow we will decouple from the Chinese, that we will create our own economy and they can create their own economy, and then we can better compete as two rival powers. Despite those best hopes, that's really very unlikely to happen. And if it were to happen, if we were to try to decouple these economies, it would cause enormous damage to the international environment. It would cause enormous damage to the United States domestically, too, on the econ side. So U.S.-China relations are just too big to throw away. That creates a problem. It creates a problem because the U.S. and China have some very serious fundamental differences, not just on the econ side, not just on the things that President Trump is protesting with regard to the trading relationship. We have very deep problems, deeper than that, in fact. The Chinese Communist Party and the United States prioritize a wholly different set of values. Senator Helms was a good Jeffersonian. On the first day of work, when I went to work in the Senate, on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, we were given a book called Empire for Liberty. It was a collection of all Senator Helms' speeches. Empire for Liberty comes from a Jeffersonian quote, a letter that he wrote to Madison. So Senator Helms is very much a Jeffersonian, and actually Americans, I think, by nature are also. We believe in certain inalienable, God-given rights. We come at it implicitly, really. A lot of Chinese do too. I mean, we believe that these are universal values, so we don't believe that only we can understand them, and we can understand that we have natural rights that other people can. The Chinese do too, but the Chinese have never developed really the societal structures or the institutions or the indigenous expression of natural rights that will sort of allow it to be undergird their government. They have basically the Chinese Communist Party, and the Chinese Communist Party does not believe in natural rights. The Chinese Communist Party believes in sort of a general right. I mean, they believe that the Chinese Communist Party, represents the will of the people, and so if you're opposed to what they say, then you must, by definition, be opposed to the will of the people. It's not really an innovation of China. It's something that goes back many years into European history too, and even before Marx it goes back. So we have this fundamentally different way of looking at the relationship between man and state, and that makes all the difference in our relationship. On the Chinese side, it means they have a terrible human rights record. They have a situation that's a lot better than they did under Mao Zedong. I mean, okay, we can all accept that, no question. I mean, they have a tremendous amount of space now in their personal lives and the way that they pursue their living and how they interact with one another economically. But they're always subject to party discipline. So the party can always step in and regulate these different parts of individuals' lives, their spiritual life. They're always subject to the party. And of course, anything that touches on politics in China is out of the question. So you're subject on the econ side and on the personal side even, and on the political side, you're absolutely forbidden to express any of these God-given natural rights. So on the one hand, you have the United States is very much driven by our universalism, our interest in natural rights, and our tendency to put our mouths wherever we think they need to be, and the Communist Party, who resents all of it and doesn't want to hear from us. And so on a range of issues, this difference exacerbates the differences we have. So the differences in our ideology, our philosophy, the way we approach the relationship between state and man exacerbates the big, real, concrete differences that we have. And we have several almost directly opposed interests. So this is the next point I wanted to make. I wanted to just go through a couple of those interests where we oppose one another. Taiwan, first of all, and most and foremost, really. From the Chinese perspective, I'm sure all of you know and realize Taiwan is a part of China, right? From the Chinese Communist Party's perspective, certainly. From a Chinese people's perspective, hard to really know what they think about this stuff, but I think they go along with what the party thinks, not worth risking their lives or their livelihoods or their careers over a disagreement about Taiwan. They'll go for that. And the Chinese are very much geared towards one day unifying Taiwan with China. Their military is crafted around it. Their procurement of military equipment is crafted around it. Their training, their diplomatic efforts, so much of what they do around the world is aimed back at this task. On the US side, we think just the opposite, that Taiwan should be free to determine its own future. I think we always say that, but I think take it even one step further, we actually don't want Taiwan to ever be a part of China, really, right? But we say it's up to them. Which it is in the end. If they really decide they want to be a part of China, I don't think the US could step in. But ultimately, we have an interest in Taiwan remaining separate, at least remaining autonomous and able to make all its own decisions. And that's why we passed the Taiwan Relations Act many years ago. Senator Helms was instrumental in that. Jimmy Carter had the great idea of switching relations between the mainland and Taiwan, and Congress stepped in and directed that not only relations be maintained, that we had some sort of contact with Taiwan, but that it was robust and that we would continue to sell arms and we would have everything short of a formal military alliance with Taiwan. So there's one example, concrete, directly opposed interests in Taiwan. Second one is South China Sea. I know it's a long way away, and I think most Americans aren't very focused on it. But it's just the principle of the thing. If you look at American history going back 200 years, one of the most consistent thing about U.S. foreign policy is its interest in freedom of sea, freedom of navigation, free trade. We fought a war about it one time. So I don't know how serious people in North Carolina take the War of 1812, but we're still complaining about it in Northern Virginia. But you know, from the Chinese perspective, so that applies for us. That applies to the South China Sea, right? And several administrations in a row now, serially, have made the point that the United States will sail, fly, and operate anywhere in the world where international law allows. and that includes the South China Sea. From the Chinese perspective, South China Sea is a lake, is a Chinese lake. One of the big controversies recently with the NBA was the NBA's use of this map. I don't know if you saw it, but they used this map that had the South China Sea drawn on it. So using exactly what the Chinese gave them, it had a map of China, Taiwan, of course, from their perspective, part of China, and the map of the South China Sea. Like we do the inset on our maps, we put the inset with Hawaii on it. They put the inset with South China Sea on it. A third area where we're sort of diametrically opposed is on North Korea. The difference here is that North Korea has been involved in developing these nuclear weapons now, a nuclear weapon program, missile program. They've been developing this now for 30 years or so. And they have achieved the capability at this point to reach the entire continental United States with missiles. They also have an active nuclear program, and most experts, including US officials, estimate that they have the ability actually now to marry those two things together. That's a big problem for the United States. But the truth is, it's not such a big problem for the Chinese. The Chinese have played with it over the years, and they have tried to pretend like we're on the same page and we both care about this, but the missiles are aimed at us. And as long as the missiles are there, they also help preserve North Korea as a buffer between South Korea and the US, military alliance, and China. And they're just perfectly happy with that continuing for as long as necessary. The fourth point I wanted to make here was that is about our alliances in the Western Pacific and why they're so important. The U.S., as you, I'm sure, appreciate, is a resident power in the Pacific. I think a lot of the more isolationist rhetoric out there, or even people, we don't necessarily have to call them isolationists, but people that not too keen on U.S. presence around the world, I think that some of them fail to recognize the stake that we have just physically in the Pacific. You know, we've got presidential primaries coming up right next year. You'll have Democratic primaries in Guam, Republican primaries in Guam, Northern Mariana Islands. These people will be voting to determine who runs in each of our parties. They can't vote in the general election, but they'll vote on that. And they have representatives in our Congress. And we've got a dozen other unpopulated territories throughout the Pacific. So we're there on a very permanent resident basis. But in addition to that, and in some ways more significant when it comes to defending U.S. interests, is we've got 5 treaty allies in the region. Japan being the most important, really, because Japan houses the U.S. 7th Fleet and a dozen other military bases across the services. I mean, that's a big deal. The U.S. 7th Fleet is a big organization with a very long history and central to defending U.S. interests in the region. We have 25,000 so troops on the border with North Korea, between North Korea and South Korea, whose mission is to be ready to fight tonight. I mean, that's their official motto, ready to fight tonight. That's a pretty serious commitment. We have Australia. There's no other country in the world, maybe except for the UK, that has as close sort of symbiotic relationship with the US as Australia and its forces. I mean, they plug right into our chain of command in many instances. We've operated abroad in deadly situations, and you can only do that with countries that you know very well and that are integrated totally into your operations. We've also got treaties with Philippines and Thailand, also important, kind of complicated. I won't get into that. And we have partnerships throughout the regions. Singapore and India are probably the most important, but a lot of other things. And these are essential to maintaining U.S. interests in the region, protecting our territories for one, but protecting our interest in the free flow of commerce, something that, again, we've stood for 200 years, trying to prevent war generally. We're there to keep the peace more than we are anything else. You know, I think you have to accept at the outset that maintaining those interests and protecting them is worth something, and if you do, believe that, then our allies are essential to that. If you don't believe that, then we can have more of a philosophical conversation about the level of U.S. commitment around the world and whether it's a smart thing, and I'm glad to have that conversation with you. The last point I wanted to make is just a little bit of a riddle, because on the one hand, our policy in Asia is about more than China. But we have to recognize that if we're to successfully compete with the Chinese. So it's kind of a riddle. I mean, we can't be totally focused on China and be effective in dealing with them. The thing is, the Chinese are trying to achieve dominance in the Western Pacific. I think you can say that much at least, that's a goal of theirs, to usurp the United States as the primary power, as the predominant power in the Pacific. And they're doing that by deploying their resources across all different domains, diplomatic, military, informational, economic. And they're doing it very effectively. We have to do more than just push back on the Chinese on these things. So we have to do more than just complain when they challenge our ships in the South China Sea, or when they try to isolate Taiwan. Any number of things, when they try to infiltrate our own systems, when they steal our information through cyber attacks and that sort of thing. We got to do more than just push back on them. We have to also be in the region in a way that on the face of it doesn't necessarily say anything about China. We have to be in the region ourselves, working with the other countries there on things like cybercrime and human trafficking, economic development, any number of things to convince those who we're both trying to win over that we also care about them, and we don't just care about them because there's some kind of pawn in a bigger game vis-a-vis China. So where does that leave us in the end? If you're sort of going through these various considerations for how to look at the region, where does it leave the United States in terms of strategy, in terms of approach? I think basically we're involved in a very long-term, complex struggle with China to secure specific American interests. We have to battle through these interest by interest, value by value. It leaves us in a confusing sort of relationship where we're going to continue to benefit from ties to China. At the same time, we're pushing back on the Chinese, and we're conflicted with them on a number of issues. I wish there was sort of a board game way to solve this. And I think part of the problem with the current debate generally is that it's not a board game. Okay, you all must have played Risk when you were kids, right? I mean, that's really not what's going on with China. It's more complicated than that. And if we approach it that way, we're not going to win this contest. So it's going to require a commitment over multiple generations where we're making a case that's not that easy to rally political support for. So one of the reasons why people resort to the risk type strategy is because it's easy to rally people. You can get people excited about China. They're stealing this, they're stealing that, they're burning churches, all of which they're doing. Okay, but it's easy to rally people when you're pitting one against another, and we're going into this sort of grand struggle, this new Cold War. It's easy to rally people. I don't think we can win that because it's just the wrong way to approach it. We have to make a more subtle, more complex case that's harder to rally support for. So I think that in the end makes it a bigger challenge than it would be otherwise, because it's a domestic political challenge for the United States to make that sort of commitment over a long term. So let me leave it there, and I'm glad to talk about whatever you all want to talk about. Yeah. You're Phil Donahue trot back there.
Thank you so much
Sure.
for this excellent summary of what is going on between the United States and Far East, particularly China. My name is Jessica Liao, Political Science Department at NC. So thank you, because we have to leave at 1:30 for the class. So I'll just steal from that gentleman here for the first question. So I like how you started with the differences on viewing the human right, like between the United States and China. For us, human right is a natural right, and for Chinese, they see that as a fundamental is like a right established by the state, right? And that is very different, but also very interesting things that is laid out from the opposite, the concrete opposite interest that you laid out is actually not including human rights. So I was wondering, how do you frame human rights as part of the U.S. interest on dealing with the China issue and also the region, and how much it could be elevated if it ever did. And we see, not just for this administration, a lot of previous presidencies when it comes to human rights issues with China. It all eventually, it started out high and eventually become back down.
Yeah.
Are we seeing, especially with this NBA episode, so what is happening in Hong Kong, and then how with the Xinjiang issue, how China's having this crackdown on Uyghurs. How do you see human rights could become an issue?
Yeah. Well, thank you for that question, because I don't want to give the impression that I don't value those. In fact, that's why I started with that, because I think it's, in the end, it conditions the entire way we look at China, and it is something that is always a factor in the way we look at it. You look at even the most realist-oriented thinkers out there, even Henry Kissinger, okay, recognizes the importance of human rights and the fact that it's got to be a part of the American approach to China in particular. So I see that. I look at it two ways. One, in terms of an end. I think Americans look at foreign policy generally as needing an end. That's just the way we're made up. And as an end, we do want China one day to have the same freedoms that we have here. And it's not going to come overnight. It's not going to be a revolution. On the other hand, it doesn't have to wait forever. It doesn't have to evolve over hundreds of years. Because it's a natural right, it's something that they possess already, and they just need the institutions to enact it. So as an end, it's important. As a means, as sort of a day-to-day policy with China, it cannot be the main thing. That's from my perspective, because we do have a lot of other issues that we have to deal with them on. We have a lot of things we need to confront them on. You just look at it from that perspective. So what do you decide to confront them on? They're harassing Taiwan, or they're harassing our ships in the South China Sea, or they've got troops on the border with India, or they're doing destabilizing things with cyber technology and everything else, and they're burning churches, and they're putting people in re-education camps. So if you're a diplomat, if you're sort of creating U.S. policy, you've got to be able to prioritize a little bit and speak up for those issues when you have the chance, when you have the ability to do it. You just can't do it at the expense of some of those other interests. I will say also, there are some times where those interests overlap. So our concern for Taiwan and our long commitment to Taiwan's democracy and way of life, it kind of overlaps. It's also a strategic interest of the United States at the same time. So there's instances there where you can be creative and find ways that we can pursue them together, but it's a complicated sort of calculation to make. Well, I could talk about NBA or Hong Kong, but I don't want to go on too far, so maybe if somebody else wants to talk about that, I'm glad to do that, yeah.
Are we successfully building up our Navy? I think that's probably a very strong point in dealing with that part of the world. And a couple of years back, we were diminishing our forces. Is our Navy being built up?
Absolutely. I'm glad you mentioned that, because I'm from Norfolk, so the Navy is really important for me personally. But absolutely, that is essential, the essential part of the U.S. military footprint in the Western Pacific. And yes, we are building up building up the Navy. I haven't looked at the numbers lately, but we're going from something like 280 ships, 280 ships during the Obama administration, upwards of 300 on the way to get to 330 thereabouts. 300. I think President Trump's plan is to get 350 eventually, and you have to give credit to the Trump administration for this, because the Navy was suffering, both in terms, and the military across the board, but the Navy in particular was suffering from a readiness issue, and they were suffering from dwindling numbers of ships that were available. So, if a ship's not ready, you might as well not have a ship. So readiness counts as numbers too. So when a ship is ready to sail, then you have more. And Trump has recommitted the funds necessary and got those funds through Congress 4 consecutive budgets now to improve readiness, to put more funds to readiness, and to build more ships. So I think we are on a more sustainable path there. The only problem is that shipbuilding budgets are really long-term things. They work on a 30-year basis. My only worry sometimes is that we're not actually poised to grow it fast enough in order to keep a presence there. But I'm really glad you pointed that out.
You referenced our treaty relationships like Japan, as well as partnerships. And you mentioned India, and you mentioned again about the troops on the border. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what you think the role an American-Indian relationship or partnership has in challenging China on some of these strategic imperatives, just how India, the other large, populous growing, rapidly growing power in the region, what role that relationship has with relationship to China?
I think the U.S. and India have converging interests and visions for the Indo-Pacific generally. That is, the Western Pacific plus part of the Indian Ocean there that's most relevant to American foreign policy. We have converging visions about China. And a lot of it gets to size, it gets to the rise of China. The Indians are very worried about that, have been worried for many years, for decades in fact, but especially over the last 20 years or so. And the U.S. has the same concern. So a strong India basically is in the interest of the United States because it serves as sort of a southern barrier to Chinese power over the long run and shores up what might otherwise be a weakness that the Chinese could exploit. So for the last, really since the Clinton administration, that relationship with India, U.S. relations have gone from strength to strength, and the Bush administration really took off because we got this nuclear deal with the Indians. We're selling a lot of equipment to the Indians now, military equipment. We're finding new ways to work with them, to help them develop their own technology. We're exercising, I think the Indians now exercise militarily with the United States more than any country in the world because of these shared interests. But I do single out them as a partner, and I'm going to distinguish between partners and allies because for me, even if you're the Philippines or you're the Thais that aren't really contributing that much, like this, for instance, the Singaporeans contribute really as much, if not more, than the Filipinos do to our common interests in the region, and they're not a treaty ally. But to me, signing that piece of paper and keeping your commitment to a written treaty is something that we ought to value and serves as sort of a ballast in the relationship going forward. We don't have that with India, and we'll never have that with India. The Indians will never be interested in some sort of treaty relationship, but we can work with them on a lot of common issues and develop those over the long term. The other great strength you have with the Indians is the Indian American community. We have this sort of symbiotic relationship now, and you have so many Indian Americans involved here, and at least since the 2000s, they have gotten very politically active on behalf of U.S.-India relations, and so that's another thing that I think will continue to help that relationship grow. Yeah. Oh.
I'll be pretty quick. I've been reading something on the internet. Of course, we all used to know that everything on the internet's got to be true. So
Yeah, that's right. It's not.
Question that, but reading about the internal debt of China. Is that something that's real? Is it something that the Trump administration kind of has their finger on and said, okay, you guys are writing up your own personal national debt, and I guess just if first of all, is that true, and is it significant?
Yeah, I mean, it's something that's always hard to get a handle on. I mean, in terms of debt as like bank debt as a part of overall GDP, it's hard to get a handle on. I would say at this point it's not as bad as it has been in previous eras, like in the 90s when they went through an effort to clean up all that debt. And then at a government level, it's even harder to know how much deficit there is and how much they're spending in deficit. It's important. I mean, just like it's important for us, it's even more important for them because they don't have a reserve currency. I mean, we have the blessing of a reserve currency where we, spend well beyond our means, but we have a stable currency. Everybody wants to buy American bonds, so they still buy American bonds. They don't have that luxury. So it's a problem, but they seem to weather this problem all the time. And so I hesitate to make too much out of it. Like I said, in the 90s, you had people in the 90s writing books about how the Chinese were going to collapse because of this banking problem. You had it, right after the most recent financial crisis, same sort of doomsaying going on. And now you have a lot of people saying the same sort of thing. So I think it's a significant problem. I don't think it's going to make this easy for us. And that's another interesting part of this really growing debate we have now on China, is I think that our natural American impatience is getting the best of us. We want to watch this competition play out like it's a Netflix series. Okay, you can't binge watch it. You got to make a commitment. You got to stay with it, not just for years, not just for decades, but for generations. You're going to have to see this thing through. And the Chinese aren't just going to make this easy and collapse for us. We got spoiled when the Soviets did it, right? And then that actually turned out to be a little bit longer term than we expected to, because we're still dealing with Putin today. So bottom line, I think it's a problem. I don't think it is a problem that will either lead to collapse in China or significantly constrain what they're able to do and how they're able to challenge us.
One of the things we don't hear about, at least it's not reported in the press, is our ANZUS treaty relationship with our partnership with Australia and New Zealand. How is that working now, and how do you see that in the future helping us with our China policy and our policy?
Yeah. Well, the relationship with New Zealand, I think, is still troubled by their position on nuclear weapons. So, nuclear armed ships being able to visit their ports. That was what prompted President Reagan 40 years ago to basically remove U.S. commitments to New Zealand under the ANZUS treaty, and that's still a problem. But we have found some ways to work with them anyway. It's just not as strong as it could be if they would, change this nuclear policy that they've had and has been a problem for all these years. They're also a part of intelligence sharing. They're part of the Five Eyes network. So we have better intelligence sharing with New Zealand, along with Canada and Australia and the UK, than we do anybody else in the world. On Australia, really, there is no better ally that we have than Australia. The only thing the only restraint on that relationship, on that alliance, is resources. And it's not because the resources the Australians have aren't the best. They are extremely good, but it's not that big a place. And I think sometimes in our mind, in our strategic mind, as we're mapping out the risk board, actually, I think on the risk board, Australia is one big piece, right? So it looks big, and it looks like, hey, we can use these guys. But there's a limit to how much Australia can do.
You only get 2 armies if you...
Yeah, that's right. It's only 2 armies, exactly. So,
4 provinces, let's just be clear.
okay, sorry. Yeah. But they're doing all they can do, and they have been with the United States literally for 100 years, and so much has become a cliche that, You know, the Australians are next to the United States in every major conflict we've ever fought since Australia's been an independent state, and that's just a fact. And they're going through similar kind of debates that we're going through on China. In fact, more intense right now because they're smaller, and because to some extent Australia is like a small town in some sense. The Chinese interfering in their political processes, funding candidates, co-opting different candidates, their interference in the universities in Australia. I talked to a professor in Australia just recently. He told me in his classroom, he feels like he cannot talk about China frankly because there are several Chinese students in the room, Chinese nationals, and they will go to the leadership of the university and tattle on him if he says anything too bad. So they're going through a lot of the same problems. That makes them somewhat sympathetic to where we are.
Well, Walter, what is your likely prediction, if you could make it, on Hong Kong and resolving that crisis, both short and long term?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of misunderstanding around this issue, and I only point it out because I think it does impact on how you evaluate it going forward. Hong Kong is sort of a separate system, you know, under one country, two systems. It does have a separate system, and its system is now separate. It mostly the way it's supposed to be, with a few exceptions and a few places where the Chinese are beginning to interfere. But it's important because when you see the Hong Kong police, cracking down on the protesters or arresting them, however you want to think about it, it's not the PLA. It's not Beijing directed. It's a Hong Kong force. It's a Hong Kong police force. It's not on the payroll in Beijing. Xi Jinping is not calling the shots in Hong Kong. So I think as long as that remains the case, I think there are ways that Hong Kong can resolve this. It's going to take a while. I think central to it is going to be some recognition by the authorities that the protesters have some good points. You can't just dismiss them all. The fact that this all started with this extradition law, you know, that was a legitimate problem. They were going to pass a law that allowed criminal suspects in Hong Kong to be extradited to withstand the mercies of the Chinese communist judicial system. You know, and they were right to protest that. If the administration in Hong Kong had only recognized that they were right, like 3 months before they were turning up in the streets and burning stuff and everything else, we could have avoided a lot of that. So I think now a key is to recognize some of the other demands that the Hong Kong students are making. They're not just students, actually, it's a bigger group than that, but the Hong Kong protesters are making things like reforming the public ordinances so that you define riots a little bit more specifically, so that everybody who is protesting can't be accused of rioting and then face very severe penalties for that, or giving some sort of amnesty to people who have been arrested under that law, or investigating the abuses of the police. You know, I mean, right now in Hong Kong, there's this incredible gulf between the people and the police that's not healthy. You know, I mean, the Hong Kong police for decades have been the finest force in East Asia, in any city in the region, and now their reputation is a complete mess over this. There needs to be some sort of investigation to set that straight. And I think they can handle this. I think they can take care of it if they're left to do it on their own and to make some of these decisions. There's been some news in the paper just the last day or so that Beijing is about ready to replace Carrie Lam, who is the current chief executive in Hong Kong. You know, it's her fault. Okay? I mean, you can talk about all the different societal pressures. You can talk about one country, two systems, and all this. And there are some really important pieces of context here, but on the face of it, it's all her fault. You know, it was her idea to do this stupid extradition law. You know, I've never lived in Hong Kong, and I'm sitting, what, 10,000 miles away? And when I saw it, I knew it was a disaster. And she's sitting there and she didn't know it was a disaster. And now she's the face of the arrests and the conflict with the people and the streets and everything else. She cannot possibly also be the face of reconciliation. And I think maybe Beijing is coming to terms with that. One thing I don't think is very likely, you can't rule anything out, but I don't think it's very likely, is the Chinese taking a direct intervention into the region. You know, if the Hong Kong police can't handle this, I don't know what would convince Beijing that the PLA could handle it. A city they don't know. They're going to be running around the streets chasing guys with umbrellas. You know, I don't see that happening, and I think the Chinese will be patient in allowing something to come to be resolved at the end of the day.
Is Hong Kong not just another tenement square, just a little bit bigger?
Well, I just think a lot has changed since Tiananmen Square. I think two things. One is that the Hong Kong authorities are not the PLA of 30 years ago. They kind of know what they're doing. No one's been killed in this so far. There's been some bloody incidents and things like that, but they're not going in like the PLA went into Tiananmen Square. And the people in Hong Kong, you know, they had the right to go out on the street and protest to begin with, something they didn't have the right to do in Beijing. They were doing against the authorities. In Hong Kong, they actually have the right to do that. What they don't have a right to do is throw Molotov cocktails and all of these things at the Hong Kong police. But that's another important difference, is that they've got a relatively free press. I mean, by Asian standards, they got a very free press. They have a free political debate, another thing they didn't have in China in 1989.
They have that right because of the agreement they had with,
Yeah.
that gives them the right to do what they did because Beijing does not keep its.
Yeah, that's right, exactly. Yeah, so they have these two systems where they're allowed to continue this separate system in Hong Kong, both sort of the way that they run their economy, rule of law on economic issues, and even politically they have some distance there by virtue of the treaty that the UK negotiated with China to turn back over Hong Kong too.
So didn't we see this as soon as England got out?
I don't know. A lot of people have been worried about it coming at some point. That at some point the contradiction was going to become obvious. But it's been pretty low profile up until now. I mean, Heritage is one of the few places that has devoted any time to Hong Kong at all before this summer. You know, we've had activists to Heritage, they give speeches, we write on it once in a while. We've been very focused on Hong Kong for a long time, but until now, I gotta say, it's been hard going. And if we would try to get a room together like this at Heritage a year ago to talk about Hong Kong, it'd be half as many people here. And people weren't focused on Hong Kong. Now they're focused. So I don't know how worried we really were after the Brits turned it back over. You know, and I think historically, maybe historians can look at this, but I think it's fair to go back at some point and look at the deal that the Brits made. It wasn't that great. They had some leverage themselves, and maybe they didn't get the best deal they could have gotten for the people of Hong Kong at the time.
Beijing is going to get the best of it, just like it did Tiananmen Square.
Yeah, could be.
You know, put up with it.
With the harvest just happening, can you comment on agricultural economic issues? I know in our case, for instance, say we do a market facilitation program because of the tariffs and all. Do you do any research in that area?
Well, we're looking sort of at the big policy issues involved. We're looking at the tariffs and the impact on the agriculture communities in the United States there, and that's something we're really concerned about. You know, we've got an interesting relationship with the Trump administration in the sense that we support a lot of what they're doing. You know, starting with judicial appointments, probably most prominent. The tax cuts, we were all behind the tax cuts. Even internationally, we're building up the U.S. Navy and the military. We're all on that. We're not comfortable with a lot of the trade stuff, and the impact on the ag community is one of the reasons, because there's a lot of damage that they're taking on. So we're looking at it from that way, on a big policy level, less so on looking down at the details of U.S. ag sector. One interesting aspect, though, related to China is that the Chinese are having a big problem now with pork, because they have a virus there that's killing half the population of pork, and Chinese really like to eat pork. It's a very important part of their intake on protein, and so that's impacted the trade war a little bit too, because they're in need at this point on that. They've got some other similar problems going on that's making for interesting change in the relationship.
We're hearing more and more about Vietnam, travel, manufacturing. They're taking manufacturing jobs from China. Could you speak to the environment in Vietnam, Loman,
Yeah. Yeah, I'm glad you asked about that, because one of the pet peeves I have about the way the debate on China is moving forward is that we're talking about all the other countries in the region, back in that sort of risk board type of way. We're not really looking at them having their own interests and their own ways of processing those interests, their own interest groups, their own factions. We're not really looking at what they want. So it's a really important question to look at where Vietnam stands. Vietnam is not going to be a U.S. ally vis-a-vis China. They've got some concerns with China. They've got concerns with China that are 2,000 years old, right? But they also have a Communist Party, and that Communist Party is very close to the Chinese Communist Party. And in fact, most of what they do is all behind closed doors. We don't, we know sort of the basic contours of the types of meetings they have and the structures they have in place and that sort of thing. But they're not talking about that with the Vietnamese people. They have an official policy, and they have for many years, of not aligning with any one power against another power, not allowing bases on their territory, not signing treaties. So I think the main thing with Vietnam is that it's going to on its own try to balance out the Chinese. They're going to try to push back on what the Chinese are doing in South China Sea, et cetera. But they're not going to necessarily join up with us to help. On the economic side, they are in some ways a beneficiary of the trade war, because you have some companies moving into Vietnam from China, American companies, but also Chinese companies. And that's a wrinkle in it I don't think we're all looking at, because we're looking at it as, okay, hey, yeah, let's move the companies out of China, let's move them to Vietnam. But what's happening in part is that, first of all, Vietnam has a capacity issue. It's not that big of 100 million people or so. It can't absorb all the industry from a country that's more than 10 times the size. But also, it's also attracting Chinese investment. And so in some way, sometimes you're just moving final assembly to Taiwan, to Vietnam. You're not actually changing the supply chain that much. You're just getting the export from Vietnam instead of getting it from China. So Vietnam benefits some from this trade war. But in the end, I think only a small part of what we need to be able to effectively counter Chinese ambition in the region. Hope that helps.
Do you think that the United States has developed too many dependencies on China? So that it seems to me that this administration is trying to become more to wean the American public from Chinese products, to some extent anyway. In fact, we hear the term economic colonialism at one time.
Yeah.
Do you think there's too much dependency dependency at this time? Or should we take that?
The only dependency that concerns me at all is is in the tech sector, where there's certain parts of their technology, especially that is relative to cyber space. I think we have to be really careful about that. So like right now we have these few efforts on regulating American company interaction with Chinese companies like Huawei. So we're not allowed to buy any of their equipment for the use of the U.S. government. That sounds like a pretty sound judgment to me. The big four telecom providers in the U.S. have sworn off their equipment, bringing in, putting in U.S. In U.S. networks built out of the 5G operations, and then they're on a control list for being an export to them. So I think it's wise to take that, very carefully. It's just my general approach to these, and a philosophical approach, support for free trade, that I'm not so worried about the other things. So many of the products we get from the Chinese nowadays enable a low cost of living for us. You don't have dollar stores without China, right? And you got people shopping at dollar stores all over the country, let alone shopping at Walmart. So those sort of things don't bother me as much, but the tech issues can be a really big problem.
One more question. Walter? Well, if not, you'll be around just a few minutes.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you for.
Yeah, no problem. And just because I'm on camera, I will let you know, if you want to talk to me about the NBA, I didn't avoid that on purpose. I can talk about the NBA. I'm glad to talk about that if you'd like to later. Okay.
Thank you, Walter. I just want to thank some of our special friends and donors who are with us today, and it means a lot because we can't do what our mission dictates and what we want to do without your support. So we're very humbled and very thankful for that. I will mention that Friday, Heritage Foundation is actually hosting the 8th annual Jesse Helms Lecture. It's had many wonderful speakers, but our former Helms staffer and current VA Secretary, Robert Wilkie, will be the guest speaker, and that is at 2 o'clock. I don't know exactly, it'll be live streamed, and there's a link on our website at jessehelmscenter.org. But C-SPAN is also going to cover that, I learned this morning. I'm just not sure when that will air. So maybe try it at 2 o'clock if you want to try. If not, it's on our website. But that'll be a pretty neat speech. In February, we have Kay Bailey Hutchinson, who is the NATO ambassador, to speak at Heritage for that. And we got some other events we're working on in the fall, so we'll be back. But you all have a wonderful afternoon, and thank you again, Walter. Sure. And be safe. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to meet you.
It's a pleasure to meet you. I've learned a lot. I'm going